Good morning and welcome to the 9th meeting in 2016 of the Finance Committee of the Scottish Parliament. Could I please remind everyone present to turn off any mobile phones or other electronic devices. The first item on our agenda is to decide whether to take item 3 in private. Are members agreed? Yes. Members are agreed. Our second item of business is to take evidence from the Chief Secretary to the Treasury on the agreement between the Scottish and UK governments on Scotland's fiscal framework. I'd like to welcome Mr Hands to the meeting and ask him to make a brief opening statement. Mr Hands.
Thank you, Mr Gibson. My statement, I will try and rifle through it as fast as possible, and my apologies again for being late this morning due to traffic. So thank you. So I'd like to thank you and the rest of the committee for inviting me to give evidence on the Scottish Government's new fiscal framework. In November 2014, the cross-party Smith Agreement was published. In it, the Commission stated the need for a new fiscal framework for the Scottish Government. I am pleased to say that both governments agreed and announced the fiscal framework last Tuesday, the 23rd of February, while the details of this agreement were published last Thursday, the 25th of February. The historic deal will pave the way for the Scottish Parliament to become one of the most powerful and accountable of its kind in the world. And as Lord Smith of Kelvin said himself last week, the agreement between the Scottish and UK governments sees the recommendations of the Smith Commission delivered in full. And I agree, Mr Gibson, wholeheartedly with Lord Smith. I believe that the deal both governments have agreed is fair for Scotland and fair for the rest of the UK. Before we move on to your questions, I'd like to take just a little bit of time to set out some of the detail of the key elements of the deal that we have agreed. Integral to the whole framework is how we determine the Scottish Government's block grant, once it becomes more than 50% funded by Scottish taxes. First, we have delivered on our commitment that the Barnett formula will continue to determine changes in the Scottish Government's block grant when the UK Government changes spending on public services. We have further agreed with the Scottish Government to extend the Barnett formula to cover devolved areas of welfare. And for tax, we have agreed to use the comparable model. Under this model, the Scottish Government holds the same risks and opportunities for devolved and assigned taxes as it does for devolved spending under the Barnett formula. That means that the Scottish Government holds the risk that tax per head in Scotland grows differently from the rest of the UK, and responsibility for population change will be shared in the same way for tax as it is for spending under the Barnett formula. However, for a transitional period over the course of the next Scottish Parliament, the UK Government will manage overall population change. That being said, I should make clear that the Scottish Government's funding during the transition period will still be dependent on the policy choices it makes, on the relative performance of the Scottish economy, and on Scotland's specific demographic changes. And to inform post-transition funding arrangements, we have agreed that an independent report will be presented to both governments by the end of 2021. The subsequent joint review of the framework will ensure that we are still delivering the Smith recommendations, with the Scottish Government managing the opportunities and risks associated with its powers. While one element of the fiscal framework has garnered the most attention, namely the block grant adjustment, there are other important aspects of the framework beyond the block grant adjustment. We have agreed extensive new borrowing powers for the Scottish Government. For capital borrowing, the Scotland Bill was amended by the Government on Monday to reflect an increased aggregate borrowing limit rising from 2.2 billion to 3 billion. And the Scottish Government's annual limit is being increased to 450 million, allowing for increased investment in vital infrastructure. For resource borrowing, we have agreed to extend the Scottish Government's powers to reflect the new risks and opportunities it will hold. The Scottish Government will be able to borrow up to 600 million each year for current expenditure within an overall debt limit of 1.75 billion. And in addition to managing forecast error, this borrowing can also be accessed if there is a Scotland-specific economic shock. The Smith Agreement was also clear that both governments should share the administration and implementation costs of devolution. The broad approach is the UK Government will provide an agreed contribution to the Scottish Government, and the Scottish Government will then meet all implementation and ongoing administration costs. the UK Government will provide £200 million to the Scottish Government to support the implementation of new powers. This funding will be a non-baselined one-off transfer which will supplement the block grant. In addition, the governments have agreed a baseline transfer of £66 million towards ongoing administration costs associated with the new powers. With the exception of VAT assignment, where the costs will be shared, the Scottish Government will meet all costs of devolution. This will include costs borne by the UK Government, for example, in relation to the Scottish Government's income tax powers and powers to vary elements of universal credit. Both governments have also agreed how to treat the principle of no detriment due to post-devolution policy decisions. We have agreed that all direct effects, that is to say those financial effects that will directly and mechanically exist as a result of a policy change, will be taken into account. Behavioural effects, those which result from people changing behaviour following a policy change, will be taken into account only in certain circumstances. And finally, Mr. Gibson, I wanted to touch on the important issue of independent forecasting. We have agreed with the Scottish Government that the Scottish Fiscal Commission will be responsible for producing all forecasts of Scottish Government tax revenues and demand-driven welfare, as well as forecasts of Scottish onshore GDP. This is something that I know the committee supported, and I'm pleased to say that this has been achieved. The fact that we have now agreed a framework means that, subject to outstanding actions in both our parliaments, we can get on with implementing these powers, and the Scottish Government can get on with using them. Mr. Gibson, I believe this deal is indeed a historic one. It delivers the new powers over tax, welfare and spending that were agreed by the cross-party Smith Commission. And I, for one, look forward to seeing how these new powers will be used. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chief Secretary, for that opening. And what will happen is I'll ask you some brief opening questions, and then I'll obviously allow colleagues around the table to get in. Because of the time constraints we're under, we have another 55 minutes or so. We'll all try and keep our questions brief, and I'll try and give everyone about 8 minutes. So the first thing I was going to ask you was just touching on something you mentioned. You talked about the no detriment issue in terms of policy spillover effects, the fact that there should be no detriment as a result of UK Government or Scottish Government policy decisions post-devolution. This is a question I asked John Swinney yesterday. And you also talked about the behavioural effects in certain circumstances. I'm just wondering if you can give us perhaps an example of what that might be.
Well, I think it might be better, Mr. Gibson, just to focus on sort of what I think are the overviews of the sort of spillovers that we're looking at. You know, essentially there are 3 types of spillovers that you could consider. The direct spillovers, whereby, say, a change in welfare or tax policy leads directly, in, say, a devolved area, leads directly to a change in a welfare or tax in a reserved area. And that would be an example of the sort of very direct spillover, which will be predictable, foreseeable, etc. And we've agreed to pay heed to those direct spillovers. The third area is like the second round spillover effects, where we have decided not to allow that within the mechanism. So the middle area, if you like, are the behavioural impacts, where we've decided that the behavioural impacts, I can envisage this being a fairly exceptional case, where the behavioural impacts would have to be defined as being material, somewhat exceptional, perhaps unforeseen, and we would desire have an appropriate mechanism in place for dealing with those effects. You mentioned direct effects and behavioural effects. What was the third one you mentioned? The third one was the second round effects. So these would be things which really kind of, you know, you could argue that perhaps as a tax change or as a policy change had some kind of very second round effect on say tax policy or reserve taxation or something of that nature. Can you give us an example of that? Say if somebody, I don't know, it's difficult to sort of speculate, but say you were to speculate that some small change in a welfare administration, in the payment of a welfare payment or the administration of welfare or the the level of a welfare payment were to lead to something like people having some kind of impact on a reserve tax. So let's say national insurance or something like that.
Okay, thank you very much. Now, you mentioned in your opening statement capital borrowing, and in paragraph 54 of the agreement it says due consideration was given to the merits of a prudential borrowing regime in line with the Smith Commission's recommendation. And I asked this question, I'm going to ask you to John Swinney yesterday, why was the issue of prudential borrowing rejected? Because local authorities in Scotland can borrow prudentially, so I'm just wondering why there was no agreement on why the Scottish Government should be allowed to borrow prudentially.
Well, Mr Gibson, it was considered, which is what Smith asked us to do. He asked us to consider it. He didn't say we necessarily had to do that. And we did consider it, and both governments agreed not to go down that road. What we did agree instead, as you know, was to agree a larger capital borrowing limit, which I think is appropriate. We've increased the capital borrowing limit from 2.2 billion under the 2012 Act to be 3 billion today. Perhaps even more importantly is the percentage that can be borrowed in 1 year. In other words, the annual limit will now be at 15% or 450 million. And that was the agreement that both governments have made, and both governments, I think, are satisfied with that.
Well, I realise that was the agreement, but what was the reason for rejecting prudential borrowing?
Well, as I say, we both considered it, and I don't think it's always appropriate to go through the. I don't think a lot of time. I think both governments were happy to go through with just an increase in the existing capital borrowing, and I think both governments feel that that was appropriate and will work best.
Okay, thank you. And staying with capital borrowing, in paragraph 59, the agreement says the Scottish Government may borrow through the UK Government from the National Loans Fund by way of a commercial loan directly from a bank or lender through the issue of bonds. Will there be any preferential interest rate on that, or it will be a straight commercial loan, or will there be a premium to be paid on interest?
Well, the National Loans Fund is already established, and that is the vehicle by which the Scottish Government can borrow from the UK Government at present. I'm not aware of any proposals to change the mechanism of the National Loans Fund as a result of this fiscal framework.
Okay, thank you very much. Now, obviously, one of the big issues over recent weeks, and one of the reasons it speculated in the media why it was difficult to come to an agreement, was the report that the original proposals would cost the Scottish budget some $7 billion over the next 10 years, and I've never seen a UK government response to really challenge those figures. Was there an aim on the Treasury side of the negotiations to end the Barnett formula or introduce a kind of long-term reduction to Scotland's budget? Because that's clearly the perception by many here.
No, well, thank you for the question, and it gives me the opportunity to put on the record that no, that was never the intention of the UK government. The position of the UK government has been absolutely clear. It first put in the vow signed up by the Prime Minister in terms of keeping the Barnett formula. That was clearly in the cross-party Smith agreement as well, as a key part of Smith. And was also in the Conservative Party UK-wide general election manifesto last year. So our commitment to Barnett, Mr Gibson, is absolutely clear. I think, to be fair, I think the only people who want to get rid of Barnett are those who are in favour of either full fiscal autonomy or independence.
So why was there a reluctance to adopt the per capita index deduction method?
Well, there was discussions about, as I'm sure you know, about quite a few different models and the merits of the different models. You'll also be aware of quite a lot of external academic debate about the merits of the different models. It is no secret that the UK government's preferred model, because we felt that it best matched Smith, was the levels model. The Scottish government's preferred model was the per capita index deduction model. But at the end of the day, Mr Gibson, these are all negotiations. And I think we both had to make compromises in different areas of the agreement. And I think we now have a fiscal framework that both governments feel is the right way to go forward, is the right thing that we can justify to our respective parliaments, and is also fair on taxpayers in Scotland and fair on taxpayers in the rest of the UK.
Okay, well, thank you very much for responding to my questions. I'm going to open out the session now to colleagues around the table. The first to ask questions will be Leslie, to be followed by Jackie.
Thank you. Can I just welcome you here today? I just want to ask the questions that relate to paragraph 66 about the Scotland-specific economic shock. So you've mentioned in your opening statement about I think you'd said extensive borrowing powers and the new resource borrowing up to 600 million a year. Yep. But in paragraph 66, it sets out the criteria for drawing down regarding the Scotland-specific economic shock. So in the first sentence, I really want to just ask about the detail. So in the first sentence of paragraph 66, it says a Scotland-specific economic shock is triggered when onshore Scottish GDP is below 1% in absolute terms on a rolling four-quarter basis and a 1% percentage point below UK GDP growth over the same period. And I'm going to be specific because I think this is it could be quite a critical point going forward for Scotland. So my question I asked yesterday the Deputy First Minister about the definition or his understanding of the term absolute and whether actually, because what I want to know is it absolute in nominal terms or real terms? Because there obviously are quite, the definitions is quite significant. So what's your understanding for clarity? Is it nominal or is it real?
Okay, thank you for that question. If I may, can I first of all just explain the background to this, because I think it is a really important part of the deal and actually leads through to why we need to have the independent fiscal scrutiny as well to properly derive these figures. And the answer is that it must be consistent with the UK fiscal framework. Smith is clear. The Scottish fiscal framework must be consistent with the UK fiscal framework. The UK fiscal framework uses 4 quarters of GDP as well. So the rolling GDP, which can both look at outturn of GDP as well as a forward look into the future. And actually, I could tell you that looking backwards, we don't think this specific event, the Scottish economic performance has not actually been, in these terms, particularly divergent from the UK as a whole since the times when GDP figures were really properly collected. And I think it was only during the mid-1980s that this event might have been triggered in the past, but that's notwithstanding that it could be triggered in the future. So the 1% is that the 2 criteria are basically designed to show is there a UK-wide economic shock, which is obviously the responsibility of the UK government to meet that. And secondly, within that, is there a Scotland-specific shock? And that is why we need to look at the Scottish GDP relative to the UK GDP. In terms of whether it is nominal or real, if I offer Mr Gibson to write to the committee, because the answer is it's whatever is in the UK fiscal framework, and those 2 must be aligned.
Okay, I appreciate that, actually, to get that detail. Because the second point, it's commonly accepted that a recession is a period of general economic decline, and it's typically defined as in GDP growth for 2 or more consecutive quarters. Because actually, I forgot to say, actually, there seems to be a word missing, actually, in the first bit, Scottish GDP. I think it meant to be Scottish GDP growth in that first sentence about paragraph 66. So if we're defining a recession as 2 quarters, when I asked the Deputy First Minister yesterday about actually this criteria, he agreed that actually it could be up to 15 to 18 months that it could take to actually trigger this additional drawdown. So can I ask you, so what, do you think that's fair? If a technical definition of a recession is for 2 periods of negative growth, whereas the criteria set here, it could be to be 15 to 18 months for this additional borrowing.
Let me try and answer that through you, Mr. Chairman. The first is that, again, to reiterate, it needs to be consistent with the UK Fiscal Framework. And the UK Fiscal Framework, we define an economic shock as being 4 consecutive quarters of below 1% growth, and those can be both outturn and forecasts. So it needs to be consistent with that. You're right, Ms. Brennan, that economists will normally define a recession as being 2 consecutive quarters of negative growth. But what we are talking about here is like a divergence of enough consequence from Scotland compared to the rest of the UK. Our starting point is, of course, not a negative GDP, but a UK GDP of less than positive 1% over those 4 quarters. So what this rule is intended to get at is the relative performance of the Scottish economy, which may need, obviously the absolute performance in terms of an absolute recession or a below 1% event over 4 quarters will be dealt with by the UK government. The question in front of us is what would we do? How would you define a Scotland-specific event? And by the way, can I just add, for the benefit of the committee, Mr. Gibson, of course, the resource borrowing isn't only about the Scotland-specific economic shock. That 600 million per annum limit can be for in-year cash management, a maximum of 500 million, 300 million for forecast error, as well as the 600 million for the cyclical downturn. So the resource borrowing powers, the cyclical downturn powers, will probably be the one that is the least used of those 3 powers within resource borrowing. I'm not meaning in any way to sort of downgrade its importance, but there's very, very significant new powers, which is exactly what Smith said, because Smith said there should be significant additional resource borrowing powers, and that is what we've delivered, particularly in the in-year cash management and the forecast error powers as well.
Okay.
I'm going to have to let others in, I'm afraid. Less than 40 minutes left. Jackie, to be followed by Mark.
Thank you very much, and can I welcome Chief Secretary to the meeting today. The block grant adjustment mechanism has obviously been agreed for a period of 5 years. You described it as a transitional period, and I wonder whether that isn't just a sign that the Treasury hasn't quite given up on the comparable model. But I wonder if my first question is, you're obviously going to be producing figures both for the comparable model, which is your preference, and the per capita index deduction model. Do you see any difficulty in publishing both numbers so that we understand the difference?
No, I don't. I mean, I think that there will be both the comparable model and then it needs to be reconciled with what the per capita index model would have delivered. So I don't see any problem in publishing those figures.
Excellent, thank you. Now, there obviously is the joint review in place for the mechanism beyond 5 years. I'm curious to know, despite all the best efforts that may be put into this, what happens if at the conclusion of that review both governments don't agree on the way forward? I suppose what I'm wanting to know is, what is the status quo that we would default back to? Is it a pre-agreement position, or is it actually just the agreement we have reached just now?
Okay, well there isn't, Mr. Gibson, there isn't a status quo. What the position is that the independent review, so there'll be an independent report on the block grant adjustment during the course of 2021, and then there'll be a review on the whole fiscal framework early in 2022. But I think the most important thing here is that the 2 governments have it in their common interest to find a deal that will be workable. We've done it before. We did it in relation to the Scotland Act 2012 and the Scottish rate of income tax, which is now coming in. I'm glad to see that being debated in the Scottish Parliament in terms of the effect that might have. I think that was one of the intentions behind income tax devolution, was to have a debate about tax rates in Scotland between the different political parties and different democratic representatives. And I'm confident that we will find agreement again. The 2 governments, this time has been a lengthy negotiation. I'm not letting anybody into a secret there. We've had 10 different meetings. But ultimately, the 2 governments have worked well together, and we've got an agreement that will work for both parties.
So does this mean you're going to be persuaded by the per capita index deduction model? Because the 2 do generate significantly different sums. Well,
it will depend on the course of Scottish economic development, indeed the rest of the UK economic development over those 5 or 6 years. So the review has no preconceived outcome in terms of which model might be used, and nor does it even state what the selection of models could be.
Indeed. Let me press you on this, because despite agreements being reached in the past, there is the possibility that agreement might not be reached. I simply want to explore what would happen in those circumstances, what the financial position of the Scottish Government would be relative to what Treasury are thinking about this, because I think we need to look at all the possibilities in the round. So if there isn't that agreement, what position remains? Is it the transitional arrangement that would carry on, or is it something else?
There's no preconceived plan in that. It is clear there's no default indexation model, and the review will be entirely unprejudiced. We'll have no preconceived view. It will be an independent review set up by the agreement of the two governments. Both governments will have to agree the terms of the review. And as I say, I think it will be in the interest of both governments to get an agreement and to get a deal. And by the way, I think it will be a little bit easier in 2021 and 2022 than it is today. Because, of course, by then we will have had 5 years of experience of the fiscal framework, and we'll actually have real evidence in front of us of how the fiscal framework has been working, which I think will help inform that debate and inform the independent review in particular.
I'm short of time, so I will be very brief with the next couple of questions. We expected to see detailed annexes to the agreement. They were certainly promised to us by the Deputy First Minister. Can you tell us when they're likely to be published?
I can't give a specific date through you, Mr. Gibson, but they are being actively worked on, and they will be available as soon as possible.
Okay, and a final question, Convener. We have dates for implementation of most of the powers. There's no date for the implementation of the welfare powers. Is there anything that, because I understand switching off a benefit is probably easier than switching it on. Are there any kind of barriers to that power being transferred as far as the UK government are concerned?
No, I don't. I think barriers would be the wrong word, but I think we do have to make sure it's in both governments' interests, and particularly in the interests of the welfare, the benefit recipient, that the mechanisms are in place between to allow that transfer to take place. It wouldn't be in the UK government's interest nor in the Scottish government's interest for that transfer to take place prematurely before the Scottish government is ready to administer that benefit. But ultimately this will be down to the joint work between the two governments in making sure that the time is right. But I think the two governments will work well in that space, and nobody would want to do anything that could jeopardise in any way the welfare recipient's ability to get that benefit.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Mark, to be followed by Gavin.
Thank you very much, Convener. Chief Secretary, I wonder, in terms of assisting us in terms of our parliamentary scrutiny, would you be willing to publish the documents that the Treasury put forward with their proposals as part of the negotiation and discussion that took place? I think it would be very helpful for us in terms of gaining a greater understanding of the negotiation that took place, and also what the starting points and changing in positions of each government was.
Well, let me answer that, Mr. Gibson. I think the first thing to point out is we have actually published some quite extensive documentation in terms of the communiques after each of the 10 joint exchequer committees, which give the items discussed and an idea of progress, the fiscal framework itself, and the technical annex to follow. Those are all significant amounts of documentation. In terms of the documentation relating to the negotiation, of course, both governments agreed not to provide a running commentary during the course of the negotiations. And it hasn't been done in the past, to the best of my knowledge, that kind of working papers for the course of the negotiations of this kind of nature between the governments have been published before. I personally think it would be an unwelcome development. There'll be a number of further negotiations and agreements between the two governments, and indeed between the UK government and other devolved administrations in the coming years. And I think intergovernmental negotiations do need an area of space whereby they can be informed, put forward papers in the knowledge that that will remain confidential to those discussions and preserve the integrity of those discussions.
Sure, but you'll appreciate, though, and the convener asked you in his opening question about the speculation, which I'm led to believe is well founded, that the initial starting point of the Treasury was a model which would have led to a reduction over time in terms of Scotland's finances, basically. You've contested that that is not an accurate reflection of the UK government's position. Do you not think that would be assisted by us being able to see what the detail of that was, what the government was putting on the table?
Well, I'm clear, Mr. MacDonald, that everything that we have done, everything that we, the UK government, have proposed at all times through the whole negotiations is consistent with Smith. I don't recognise the figures that you and the convener have used. I think I heard one of those figures for the first time at Prime Minister's Question Time yesterday, put to the Prime Minister as question one. It was actually right at the very top of Prime Minister's questions that figure was used. I know there's been a lot of academic debate, and a lot of the academic sources have tried to look forward. But ultimately, in terms of any sort of look forward, it will depend on what the economic performances are, even in the transitional period. I think you have to recognise the sort of the risks and responsibilities being taken on by the Scottish Government in this area. I mean, the Scottish Government is taking on economic risk. It's taking on the risk that tax per head in Scotland grows differently to tax per head in the UK. It's taking on a lot of, it's taking on demographic risk apart from the headline population risk, but there is demographic risk within there in terms of the types of population increases relative to the rest of the UK, whether you're talking about taxpayers, whether you're talking about elderly people and so on, that is still risk that will be held by the Scottish Government in terms of some of this demographic risks. And also in terms of the policy choices as well, a lot will be dependent on what the policy choices are that will be made by both the Scottish Government and the UK Government. I mean, after all, these powers are designed for there to be policy choices taken by the Scottish Government. So it's often very, very difficult to look forward with numbers. What I can say, looking backwards, with the model most recently proposed by the UK Government, was that over the last 15 years, compared to the status quo, compared to Barnett as the status quo, it would have actually yielded an additional 6.5 billion over that time in funding to the Scottish Government. That was the most recent form of the comparable model that was proposed by the UK Government.
Okay. Just want to return very briefly to the question that Jackie Bailey asked about what happens in 2022 if there's no agreement. And I appreciate you want to view this through an optimistic prism, and that's fine, but we also have to look at the what-ifs on this committee. The Deputy First Minister indicated to us yesterday that if there was no agreement, that essentially the position would default to the status quo, which would be the status quo at that time, which would be the continuation of the transitional model. You appear to have indicated that that's not the case. Now, obviously, if there is no agreement, there has to be something that gets defaulted to. So what would be your understanding of if there wasn't an agreement reached between the two governments, there needs to be a continuation of some form of fiscal framework beyond 2022? What's your understanding of what happens in that circumstance?
Well, I think the answer I gave earlier, there is no default. So both governments would need to agree the arrangements beyond the transitional period. However, I do think that we would be able to do that. A, we've done it before, and B, we'll actually have real-life experience of the fiscal framework having been in place, income tax devolution powers having been in place by that point for 5 or 6 years.
If I could just...
Yeah.
I understand and appreciate where you're coming from in that you think that an agreement will be reached. But the point is this: if at this point in time an agreement had not been reached, the simple fact is the Scottish Government would be recommending to us that we reject a legislative consent motion because there was no agreement on a fiscal framework. If in 6 years' time there is no agreement, those powers will be here, they will have been exercised, the fiscal framework transition will have been running, so there isn't that position of, well, we'll just not accept the devolution without a fiscal framework. There will have to be some form of fiscal framework continuation if there cannot be an agreement reached. We can't get to the point in the last gasp in 2022 and say, well, we've not agreed. There has to then be something that follows on. So my question is, what is the UK government's understanding of what would happen in that circumstance. However remote the possibility you consider might be, you have to have a position of what would happen next.
Well, okay, there would be no default option. Secondly, that is effectively the point of the independent review, would be to look at this whole question, look at the operation. I personally think it would be difficult for either government to go against the central substance of that independent review. And that will be, if you like, the importance of the independent review, which is why we've agreed to have this independent review in the first place. But I remain confident the governments, would find a way through. It's difficult to know exactly who the governments will be in that year, but nevertheless, I think it will be the onus will be on both governments to find a way through. That's why the independent report will be there, and the review process is there. I have confidence in that process.
The PMQ you referred to was asked by my wife, Patricia Gibson.
Right.
Incidentally.
Well, good thing I was complimentary about it, Mr. Gibson.
Almost. Gavin, to be followed by John.
Thank you. Chief Secretary, Mr. Swinney was asked yesterday about the Joint Exchequer Committee. What does it look like? And he gave the answer that it is basically him and you, flanked by officials. Clearly that works if the two personalities can work well together, and that certainly appears to be the case at the moment. But there could well come a time where the personalities of the two individuals involved, whether that's 5 or 10 years down the line, don't work quite so well. What structural changes do you think are needed to the Joint Exchequer Committee in order to make sure that the process can flow essentially regardless of who's in post?
I think that's a reasonable question. I don't envisage any structural changes to JEC at the moment. JEC is technically, if I'm not mistaken, the Deputy First Minister, myself, the Financial Secretary, the Treasury, and other people at the request of the two governments. It's been in place for some time, and I think it's worked pretty well. I don't see any issues there, or have any plans to change it. I'm sure if a need was felt, the two governments would discuss it and come to an amicable agreement. Okay,
all right. In terms of we discussed the Scottish Reserve yesterday, which I think is a positive development in terms of the increase in size and actually a bit of increased flexibility. How were the figures and the conditions of the Scottish Reserve reached by the two governments?
Yeah, well, I think the Scottish Reserve or the cash reserve, I think is an underappreciated part of the agreement. I think it gives a really very, very significant flexibility, budget flexibility for the Scottish Government. To understand it, it's different to resource borrowing. This is not borrowing. This is the ability to build up a reserve. Others might call it a rainy day fund, which will assist in longer-term planning of the Scottish Government and greater flexibility within its budget. And the limit in that reserve is 750 million, which is a very, very sizable reserve, a very flexible and powerful reserve, with annual drawdown limits, which are 250 million for resource and 100 million for capital. So I think this is a powerful mechanism to assist budget management, which both governments, I think, will really appreciate, particularly with the greater risks and responsibilities being taken on, that you do need to have a greater ability to plan for the long term.
Okay, thank you. You were asked earlier by a couple of people about the behavioural responses to various changes and how it linked in with the no detriment principle. And we talked through direct effects, which I think are reasonably straightforward. You talked about secondary effects, which are off the table. The one in the middle for me is the most difficult one, which is the behavioural effects. When I was a corporate lawyer, when you signed up to an agreement, we would spend a long time working out all the things that might go wrong in terms of disputes, and at a time when two parties were friends effectively, work out how those disputes might be resolved so that when it actually came to it, there was a simple contract to look at. In terms of this, you've got an outline of how disputes might be resolved, but I just wonder, some of the disputes are unforeseen, fair enough, you can't do much about them, but some are potentially foreseen. And I just wonder if there's any merit in both governments, at a time when relations are clearly very good and there's not a dispute, to work out some of the issues that could arise over the course of 5 or 10 years, and decide now, when we're not actually in dispute, to work out how you might approach. So there are some illustrative examples out there. I just wonder if that's something you'd be willing to consider.
Well, I think that's a very reasonable question. I think what we were trying to get at was a system whereby the direct spillover effects would definitely be dealt with. And those, by the way, could go either way, of course. Sure. What we wanted to do was to have a mechanism in place for the behavioural impact that would be used really sort of exceptionally, would not regularly be used. We don't want to be having sort of an annual reconciliation. There might be, a little bit of this and a little bit of the other between across the two borders. That was not. I don't think that would be in the long-term interests of either government to have financial stability and budgetary stability. We did want to have in place some kind of a mechanism whereby behavioural impact could be assessed. It could be informed by independent evidence, perhaps from the OBR and the Scottish Fiscal Commission, but would ultimately be a decision for the two governments following a dispute resolution process that is explicit in the Fiscal Framework. So we wanted to have that in there, but I don't think either party would want to have that really used on a regular basis, because we do want to have the ability for people to operate and be flexible on things like tax rates that they think is appropriate, decisions taken by the respective government for their respective taxpayers that they would think would be appropriate in that environment.
Okay. And finally, if I may, Convener, you've talked about independent forecasting. Both governments have obviously signed up to that. Can you just, I guess, explain the reasoning behind getting the forecasts done independently by the Scottish Fiscal Commission?
I think that's incredibly important. Can I pay tribute to your committee, Mr. Gibson, in terms of the good work that's been done on pushing for that? I think from the UK government's perspective, when we went down this road in 2010 with the creation of the Office for Budget Responsibility, was seeking to move to a point where the forecast could be really well trusted as being independent from government and independently derived. That's the first thing. Now, the second thing is it's not really for me as the UK government to in any way sort of dictate what the Scottish circumstances would be. But what I would say is, given the fact within the fiscal framework there are comparisons between, for example, UK and Scottish GDP, that I think it's essential that the two forecasts are done in the same way, in this case independently of government, for us to be able to make that assessment.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you. Convener.
Thank you very much. John, to be followed by Jean.
Thanks, Convener, and good morning, Mr. Hans. Good to see you.
So you've prospered since I last saw you.
Thank you. Yes, moved up in the world. The baseline adjustment to the block grant is touched on in paragraph 11 of the Heads of Agreement, and it talks about the initial baseline deduction will be equal to the UK government's receipts generated from Scotland in the year immediately prior to the devolution of powers. Now, previously, when there was discussions, the suggestion was that for some taxes, at least, obviously they go up and down from year to year, and a 5-year average or something like that might have been more appropriate. Could you just explain why the agreement was eventually to have just focus on that 1 year before devolution?
Yeah, well, I think that's consistent, Mr. Mason, with how devolution has always been done. It's always been done in the year that the year zero, effectively, when devolution happens. And I think that's an important principle because the UK government may well have taken different policy decisions in those previous years that could effectively almost sort of have distorted that. What you want to do is to look at devolution at the impact at the point of devolution. There is one exception to this, and it's not a very substantial exception in terms of the amount of money, but it's in terms of cold weather payments, where we did, because of the fact it's effectively referencing the weather, which is certainly, actually that's a separate debate in its own right as to whether that is influenced by government policy decisions. I think perhaps it is, but I'm straying down an area of other government policy. That we did agree in terms of cold weather payments that would be averaged out over a longer period. But I think in general one wants to stick to the principles of devolution, which is the point of devolution.
So even on, say, the property tax stamp, which was stamp duty land tax, now our LBTT, if it was a particularly poor year the year before devolution, we would gain from that point of view just because there would be expected growth, but you're happy to live with that?
Well, again, I think it's important to be consistent in these things and important to deal with it at the point of devolution.
Okay, thank you. On the indexation mechanism, I mean, there's been some questions on that already, and the whole point that it's going to be the in paragraph 17, the comparable model, and then adjusted for what would be delivered by the index per capita method. Will all of that be published so that these figures will all be in the public domain?
Sorry, will the model
Well,
be...
both models, so the difference under if it was just the comparable model, we would see that figure, and then if it was what adjustment is made by the fact that it's indexed.
Okay, can I think about that, and can I perhaps get back to the committee in terms of precisely what would be published in terms of the models? But I think it would be in the interest of everyone to have as much transparency as we can reasonably have on that.
Okay, thank you, that's fine. On admin and implementation costs, again, I think that's been touched on slightly. Could you just explain, I mean, we came up with the 200 million. Is that effectively just splitting the difference? Because previously, I mean, one of the no detriment principles was whoever made a decision on powers would kind of carry the cost. And I've always wondered why, given that a lot of these decisions are made at Westminster, it's the Scottish Government that even has to pay the cost for switching off a UK tax. That doesn't strike me as holding the no detriment principle, is it?
Well, Smith is actually very interesting in this area, Mr. Basin, because it does, if you like, change the precedent to say that there should be the UK government should bear a bear a share of the costs of devolution, both governments estimated implementation costs. You're right to be around 400 million. And we did agree to effectively split that down the middle at 200 million each. Now, if you were to say that doesn't sound like very much, I mean, what I would say is I think, if I'm correct, about 2 years ago, the Scottish Government's assessment of what the costs of independence as a whole would be was, I think, only 200 to 250 million. So I think 200 million is a very generous number in terms of meeting the implementation costs. And we're also, of course, transferring 66 million in terms of transferring the marginal savings from departments in addition to that as well.
Okay, thank you. VAT, I realise a lot of work is still to be done on, but I think it's been agreed to use the kind of consumption method so that it would be the end consumer paying VAT that will be the principal. And I mean, I've always wondered if we built a factory in Scotland, that would add value. Normally there would be VAT received because of that, but Scotland would not receive any of that VAT. Do you feel that's a fair principle?
Well, we agreed what we agreed, and I have to say, Mr. Basin, the VAT assignment was not a major part of the debate. I think both governments were comfortable, happy with how we're doing that. We're doing... actually, VAT assignment will be fully online a little bit later than income tax. It will come in 2019-20, again to reflect the proper kind of assessment of the workings of the methodology over that time. But both governments are in agreement with the methodology, and we're both happy with that.
Okay, and finally, if I may, I am the one member of the committee who disagrees that the SFC should be doing the forecasts. I mean, would you accept that the OBR is not really completely independent? There's been stories about it being lent on. It's very dependent on HMRC for its figures. So independence is not linked with who does the forecasts, is it?
No, I strongly disagree with that. I think the OBR is a robust and independent body. One has to recognise the difference between independence and being, if you like, not interacting. And here is where one has to get it right. You have to have interactions, in our case, between the OBR and the Treasury. Because the OBR needs to assess the potential policy changes being produced by the Treasury. So at the moment, in the lead up to the budget, there'll be interaction between the Treasury and the OBR in terms of looking at the scorecard. So the Treasury needs to say, well, this is what we are potentially proposing, this is what we're looking at. What do you think the impact would be on the public finances if we were to do this or the other? And the OBR quite rightly comes back with an assessment, and that is an iterative process. that can go on for some time. But that is in no way calls into question their independence. They will give an entirely independent view. The particular, I think you might be talking about the case that where came to light recently, a Treasury Minister had passed on very indirectly a suggestion. And I actually did have a look at that email exchange. It was between my predecessor as Chief Secretary, and I didn't think there was anything wrong with that particular email. I don't think he was seeking to change the forecasts in any way. So I am confident of the robustness and the independence of the OBR. The OBR has been given really a very strong review, an external review by its Canadian equivalent, and Robert Choate has been reappointed for another term. I think it is a very good body, and I think it's transformed that whole area of UK budgetary forecasting to go independent. I think that has just been immensely beneficial, and I don't hear anybody, Mr. Mason, anybody in Westminster who's proposing going back to the old system where the government did its own forecasts.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Jean.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning, Mr. Hans. Very early on in your opening remarks, you made the statement that Scotland, with these new powers, becomes one of the, I can't paraphrase, but one of the most powerfully devolved governments in the world. That is patently not true. Research shows that there are many devolved governments that are. Will you stop using the phrase, because it's really irritating when it's simply not fact? Okay. I mean, we can have a disagreement about this, and I think I'm about to appear in front of the Devolution Further Powers Committee, who may well have questions in this area. What I would say is, even if we weren't to agree on that, I think we would say that through the Scotland Bill going through at the moment and the Fiscal Framework, the Scottish Parliament will become a lot more powerful and a lot more accountable. And I think if you and I could probably just at least agree on that, I think it is, I think the accountability, by the way, is also incredibly important in terms of increasing accountability to taxpayers, which is one of the points behind tax devolution in the first place. I don't doubt there are merits in the arrangements. But it is not the most devolved regional government in the world of other countries to look at. Anyway, we won't go on with that. When we were talking about the tax base and so on, you highlighted a number of the risks to Scotland. For example, the tax per head or population growth. It does seem to many of us that we have a lot of the risks, but often not enough of the responsibility in order to change that. In other words, it's very difficult for Scotland to grow its population when that's something that is a reserve power in terms of bringing people into the country and so on. So there is a lack of power actually to grow many of the incomes that we might that are at risk. Would you agree with that?
No, I wouldn't. And I think what you're getting to, if I may, I think you're talking about the reserve power, immigration powers. And what I would say to that is I think it is quite right that immigration powers remain reserved. I think you and I may differ on that, but nevertheless, I think that is the right thing. But secondly, the Scottish Government has got considerable powers to attract more people to Scotland, both people who are coming to the UK in the first place and choosing where to go to in the UK. And secondly, within the UK, the Scottish Government's already got very significant planning powers, housing powers, transport, brilliant universities, skills powers, schools powers, health powers, all kinds of different things to attract more population both within the UK and to those moving to the UK from abroad. So I don't agree with you that there aren't powers for the Scottish Government to do something about population.
Okay. We will agree to differ. And just finally, given that, there's a bit of discrepancy between the vow and the Smith recommendations, but there are a lot of people concerned, I think, in your government too, that these are laws made in haste, that it was a declaration
in desperation when it looked as though we might gain independence, that the vows and the Smith Commission have been done in haste. And given that we have this declared transition period, do you think that that's something that needs to be worked on almost immediately? That, in fact, what is happening in Scotland in the next 5 years is going to be very significant as we look at these outcomes, and that there should be real clarity around them, including the Barnett formula and its calculation. But that will take a long time, so that it won't be something that needs to be established in the final year of the 5-year period, but actually is crucial that we start looking at the kind of data that's required now. And would you see that some review for this committee and this Parliament would be looking at that in detail, at least annually or every 6 months between now and then?
Well, I'm sure there will be, Mr. Gibson, through you, I'm sure there will be plenty of commentary over those 5 years about the workings of the fiscal framework. But I think if your suggestion, Ms. Urquhart, is to effectively start the review now and have a 5-year ongoing review, that is not something I would particularly favour, and that's not what is in the agreement. It's taken us 10 months to get to this agreement, and I'm not feeling a natural urge to start reviewing it right away after all of that work. But I'm sure there will be plenty of independent commentary, as, to be fair, there has been on the different models and the negotiations on the fiscal framework up to now, to help inform. And that's actually the most important thing, is that the review, that's why I have a lot of confidence in the review, that it will look at 5 years of real experience prior to then, in a way that we can't really do so today. We can look back as to what models would have done in the past, and we can think about, speculate about what models might bring in the future. But by then, there will be a real experience to inform that review.
Thank you very much. And that's concluded questions from members of the committee. Just one further point I was going to ask Chief Secretary, which is, will the OBR continue to forecast revenues for Scottish taxes, or will the Scottish Fiscal Commission be the only forecast published?
That is a good question. I genuinely don't know the answer to that, Kavina. I think I would look forward to. I don't think that in any way should inhibit if that were the case, I don't think that should inhibit in any way the Scottish Fiscal Commission. But if I were to write to the committee as to whether, clearly the OBR does have to assess GDP, taxation revenues and so on throughout the whole of the UK. So I think your question is whether they would then specifically break down a Scotland-only component in it. I would have to check, and I think I'd have to check exactly what the ONS are also doing in that space. So rather than me sort of idly speculating, Mr. Gibson, if I can write to you on that point.
Yes, that would be very much appreciated, and I do want to appreciate you for your succinct and very clear answers to the committee. And I'd also like to thank committee members this morning. We've been very tight for time. I understand you started over 20 minutes late, and I would point out that if it was a Department of Work and Pensions interview, you would now be sanctioned, actually, for being more than 15 minutes late. You do have a busy morning, so we won't keep you any further. Just to ask if you have any further points you want to make to committee before we wind up this public session.
The only thing I'd say, Mr. Gibson, is that the traffic in Edinburgh, I have to say it's perhaps not as bad as in my constituency in West London, but it can be still pretty bad at rush hour. And it was the first flight from anywhere in London to get to Edinburgh, so there was no way I could have been here earlier.
I know, and understand you probably couldn't have stayed overnight because of work at the house, but I appreciate you coming in any case. It was great to have you, and I think we did get through a lot this morning, so I wish you well for the next committee, and thank you very much for coming to speak to Finance.
Thank you.
Okay, so thank you. That being the end of our public deliberations, I'll now call a 2-minute recess, and then we'll go into private session.